Hello everybody, in last week's exciting episode of JayEmm on Cars we looked at this, the Audi 80 variant, one of the first cars in the modern era to wear the Audi badge, and if Volkswagen management had had their way, it would have also been the last. You see, Volkswagen acquired the Auto Union Group and its subsidiary brands for one simple reason: the manufacturing capacity that they had. This car was a bit of a Brucey bonus. The idea was at the end of its life it was going to be mothballed and the factory space used to build more Beetles. But one man didn't want that to happen. His name was Ludwig Krauss, an ex-Mercedes man and the chief engineer for Audi. He could see the writing on the wall already because he'd been given strict instructions to do only the work necessary to maintain and keep reliable the current Audi portfolio of one car. And he was told not to develop anything new. Realising this meant in a few years he'd probably be out of a job and the Audi brand would be shoved straight back into the drawer that VW had found it in, he decided to go it alone and developed in secret a new car. So secret was this endeavour that Krauss didn't even tell his boss, Auto Union chief executive Rudolf Leiding, who also would have certainly been out of a job in the next few years. And Leiding only found out about this when one day he bumped into the full-size clay model that Krauss had built of his proposed new car. Fortunately, Leiding liked the new car and told him to carry on in as clandestine a manner as he could manage. Eventually, the car had to be presented to VW's board, and luckily they loved the idea and gave the go-ahead for it to move into production. It was called the 100. Introduced first in saloon form in 1968, it turned out to be a huge success. It sold over 800,000 examples during its lifespan and instantly cemented Audi's reputation as a brand which could compete on equal footing with BMW and Mercedes, and meant that they were going to stay around for good. Now, as you can probably tell, this is not a saloon. This is the 100 Coupe S, a fastback which sold in much smaller numbers, around about 30,000 over its shorter life. This is a late model, 1972. And isn't it gorgeous? Part Mustang, part Aston DBS, part something else entirely. This was codenamed the C1, and believe it or not, is actually a precursor to the modern Audi A6. Interior-wise, this car is a vast step up in quality over the old 80. It's a really nicely made car. Feels a lot better put together than, say, an equivalent Ford of the time. It is still peak 70s in here, don't get me wrong, but it does feel considerably more modern, thanks to things like the regular floor-mounted gear shifter. This huge steering wheel is a bit of an oddity, but the gauges are easy to read, and there are some strange things in here, like the fact that one gauge appears to tell you the layout of the gear shift. But otherwise, this is a pretty decent car and reasonably roomy too. Of course, if you wanted something a little bigger, you'd go for the mechanically identical saloon, but if you wanted something sexy, this is it, and it is a good looker, isn't it? Now, motive power comes from a slightly enlarged version of the 100's engine, producing either 115 or 112 horsepower from its just under 1.9 litres and 4 cylinders. Now, that was connected to either a 4-speed manual, as in here, or a 3-speed automatic gearbox. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this car looks like it should have had a starring role in a long-forgotten West German cop drama. The sort of vehicle owned by a man that knows how to bend the rules to get the results that he wants. So with that in mind, let's fire up the coupe, shall we? And see what she's like. I absolutely adore this car. Not only does it look the part, but it also drives really nicely. The 80 is certainly an enjoyable experience. It takes you back to a different time, but this is a car that I feel much more comfortable pushing that little bit harder. It is clearly a far better assembled, designed, a much sportier car than the 80. Amazing really, considering only a very few years actually separate the two. They were actually both in production at much the same time. However, this really is markedly better. Now, you feel very much more like you're sat in the car rather than on top of it. You feel that much more secure and at home. The engine has quite a bit more punch, although this one isn't perfectly happy. There's a hesitation when you first put your foot down at low RPM that then goes away and it pulls very cleanly, but I suspect the carbs or fuel system need adjusting, and it's pumping out a lot more smoke than it definitely should. At idle the other day, it looked a little bit like a two-stroke sat there, so I'm going to report back to Audi on that one. Indeed, one of the reasons that they're so keen to get a lot of us YouTubers out in these old heritage fleet cars is because it's the best way of assessing what needs doing to them. But I'm going to ignore that little hiccup. Once you're through that, the thing is then really nice, sweet, and quite progressive. The gearbox is a joy to use. It's pretty much the exact same box as was in the 80, except now fitted with a more traditional floor-mounted shifter that is actually really nice, has a great action to it. Throw's not crazy long, but it's so direct and precise. You actually want more gears to work through, and you find yourself actually pulling a reasonable amount of speed through some of the bends. Our front-wheel drive layout is actually pretty unusual for a car of this era. It wasn't a new invention by any stretch of the imagination. After all, Citroën had been doing it in the 1930s, so by the 70s everyone was more than familiar with it. However, most sporty cars would almost certainly have been rear-wheel drive still. Certainly if you're someone buying something like a Capri, I can imagine why you might turn your nose up at this. And indeed, compared to say that old Ford Capri, this car doesn't necessarily impress because it's got a much smaller engine. 1.9 litres plays the, say, 3 litres or so you could get with a Capri, and, well, it would have still been a very odd badge, I expect, for 1970s Britain to have tried to cope with. Ford would have felt much more homely, much more normal. Hard for us to imagine, but I expect back in 1972, when this car rolled off the forecourt, it's probably quite difficult to find an Audi dealership. Guess you would have gone to your local VW. It sounds really tasty in that way that only old cars can, with no catalytic converter in the way and a simple single carburetor up front. It really is a sweet little thing to listen to and an utter delight to look at. This thing turns many, many heads. Having just jumped out of the 80 into this, it's amazing how much more solid and more modern it feels. There's still some very old school things about it. No inertia reel seat belt, this massive steering wheel, which I think is pretty similar in diameter to that in the 80, but which feels a little bit more modern thanks to the 4-spoke layout. Still got a cute horn. However, you do feel far more enclosed. It has this same weird perforated white material on the headliner, but the rest of the car is a much darker, more somber affair. The perfect thing for my fictional West German police detective to drive. Inspector Tropengrin, policing the mean streets of Bonn, the German capital. He is the first, last, and only line of defense the people of that town have. His secret lair, somewhere under the Nürburgring. It is also very likely that that little stutter may be down to poor fueling. There's a very good chance I'm the first person to drive this car properly in, well, quite some time, I suspect. And she pulls to just over 6,000 RPM. Now, interestingly, the early versions of this engine, which were known as the Mitteldruckmotor, or Mitteldruck something, anyway, medium pressure engine is what I'm trying to say, they ran an insanely high compression ratio, 11.2 to 1. That's high now. That's pretty fruity. And back then, it would have been obscene. This car was designed to run on 98 octane fuel. Now, for later models, including this one, they revised that down to a much more sensible 9 to 1. Still quite high for a car of the time. Now, ventilation in here is not quite as good as in the 80. Even though I've got both windows fully down, there isn't a lot of airflow coming through into the cabin. Now, I'm not actually even pumping hot air into here, which I have done accidentally on a couple of shoots with older cars, but you do get pretty warm in this thing. Oh, it's lovely. Steering, of course, not very quick and also not very power assisted. Perhaps the greatest benefit of that front-wheel drive layout is the ridiculous amount of boot space that it gives you. To my modern eyes, you look at a car like this and think there might not be an awful lot of room in the boot, but in fact, it's absolutely cavernous. You could go camping in there. Unlike the 80, this also has a working temperature gauge perched atop the fuel tank gauge, which has sat at about half the entire time I've had this car. Because I think the fuel in it is a little bit old, I've been trying to do Audi a favour by burning off as much of it as I can. I'm that sort of good person. Turning circle is superb in this thing, because it's still a relatively light car, sitting around about a ton. when you're at anything more than sort of snail's pace, the steering is of course very light, easy to use, making the car a little bit more livable. You've also got an extra wing mirror over the 80, although currently it's pointing towards the sky, so it's really of no use to me. Parking can be a little bit difficult because unlike the 80 where the rear screen is pretty much the rear of the car, because this has that sort of fastback look to it, there's quite a bit more vehicle behind the rear glass. But none of that really detracts from the car, which overall is still very enjoyable. You can place this car with relative ease too. It's not as easy to see out of as the 80 by any stretch of the imagination, but you can still just about see the bonnet, and by modern standards it is of course still really quite diminutive. Detective Troppengrün kommt sofort. Schneller. The 80 is so cute they even gave it its own name, Ralph, which I suspect comes from its number plate, so I don't know what you call this one. Perhaps John. I think I'm going to call it Ted. Come on, Ted. Gearbox is just so nice. Really does surprise me how some of these old cars can actually be pretty good. I suspect perhaps it's a rod linkage going to the gearbox. I doubt it'd be cables. I don't think it's going directly in because it's sat a bit too far back, and this tunnel here is actually pretty thin and narrow, so I don't think there's a gearbox in there. Now, this being mechanically identical to the saloon car, it would handle therefore pretty much the same, and I've got to say, for an old late 60s platform, it's really quite good. Suspension is definitely firmer than that in the 80, but still reasonably comfortable by modern standards. I'd say it's actually perhaps a little bit better damped than the later Ford Capri that I drove recently. That was a little bit bouncy and wallowy, although a lot more powerful than this. Brakes are really quite nice. In fact, let's test them properly, shall we? Well, they're really good. Eventually you could hear the wheel chirp there, but actually much better stopping power than I expected. Really very impressed. Let's test the handling. Oh, she loads up, she dips down. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether these are the correct sized wheels for this car, because on occasion, in sort of harder cornering, you can feel a wheel tapping bodywork. And with just one person and no luggage in the car, that shouldn't be happening. So it's very possible that perhaps they're a slightly larger rolling radius than they really should have been. It's not a big issue, it doesn't happen very often, to be honest. Oh, you've got a real confidence in the car, you know exactly what it's going to do. It's very rare that I actually have this much fun in cars of this age, and I don't actually know what this is worth, but a lot, probably. I don't know. There's so few of them about there. When you try and find one for sale, it's not very easy. Pretty much, if you want to know how much it's worth, I don't know, $12.50. I've said previously that if you're looking for a nice, easy to maintain, sensible, practical, dailyable classic car from this sort of period, get a Golf GTI, something like that. It'll be great, easy to run, spares, no problem at all. If you want something really different and unusual, with a bit of flair about it, that's going to get people talking, oh, you could do a lot worse than a 100 Coupe S. It's a magnificent machine. The 80 is a product of the 60s, made using leftover ingredients from the 1950s. But this does feel genuinely like a 1970s car. It feels considerably further forwards. And I can see why people did actually like them, why they did buy them. In saloon form in particular, so make a fabulous daily driver, and maybe that would be the more sensible thing to get if you want to run one as a daily, because you're probably going to find body panels, parts going to be somewhat easier to find for that, because they were made in what, 24 times the number as these. That being said, the coupe is cool for cats. So as the closing line in my fictional detective show goes, bis morgen, Frau Ost. So there we have it, a tale of two very important, very interesting Audis. Thanks to Audi UK for lending them to me. Thanks to you for watching. I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.